Welcome back to D&D Module Monday, the show in which I read a module and then talk about it for however long I see fit. I think I've got the... So it's funny, this is actually being recorded during the day, but it's not a very bright day out, so it's actually giving me the chance to turn the lights on, and I think maybe the shadows are better now. I don't know, man. But anyway, this is going to be a very interesting episode because, I'll be totally frank, if you follow some of my community posts, I've actually been reading a lot. I've been reading the Baldur's Gate novels. They're awful. I've also been reading the game guides for Icewind Dale. And as such, that has left me with not a whole lot of time to read for Module Monday, which I know seems weird, but I think ultimately the videos that I make with the Baldur's Gate novels and Icewind Dale will be pretty cool. So I think it's worth it, but it has left me with not a lot of time to do a lot of true reading for this show. But that means I've had a bit of an opportunity to go through some of the more gimmicky stuff in my library. And one of them, a big one, is this one, Heroes Feast Flavors of the Multiverse. Now, you might remember, I actually made a video about a recipe from the first book, which was Heroes Feast. We made the Bitopian shepherd's bread. It was very good. It was delicious. Very kind of like a spiced bread sort of thing with some nuts on it. It was delicious. I wonder if I could find it in here really quickly. I maybe should have looked up the page of it before doing this, but... Oh, look at that! Look at that. But, so there's the Bitopian shepherd's bread. But that is not necessarily the purpose for this video. Really, like I said, I want to speak about the second book. I'm actually going to do away with the first book as of now. I'm going to try and set it over here. Oh yes, that certainly happened. Anyway, so wanted to take a look at Flavors of the Multiverse. I actually got this around Christmas, and I wanted to make another sort of cooking video with it, but it just, as much as I like that video about the Bitopian shepherd's bread, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because I really don't have a setup for cooking in my house. My setup for this show, getting these lights set up was like doing rocket science, and bringing it down to the kitchen area is just not really feasible. But there are a few reasons I actually wanted to talk about this cookbook. Not more so what this cookbook kind of represents, less so about the actual recipes themselves. Though if you are interested in seeing what the book looks like, I'm going to be flipping through it as I discuss sort of what point I want to get across here. Mainly that food and Dungeons and Dragons. So these types of cookbooks, these sort of themed licensed cookbooks are pretty common now. I mean, you have a Skyrim cookbook. I know there's a Fallout cookbook. I want to say there's an Animal Crossing cookbook. I know there's things like Harry Potter cookbooks, and these are all varying levels of like officialness. This one is obviously official. It says an official D&D cookbook on it. But the branded sort of video or IP cookbook is now kind of a common thing, and that makes sense because they appeal to the people of these shows. And it really gives you an opportunity to sort of take the world that these pieces of media are set in and then, expand upon them and sort of put them into our world to some extent in the way that we can now actually make food from them. And ultimately, personally, so if I haven't, I don't think I've ever just really discussed it before, I cook a lot. It's a hobby of mine. I enjoy cooking. I quite enjoy it. And I really enjoyed reading through this book. This book is kind of interesting in the sense that it actually, whereas the first book was segmented by the races, you had foods set up by the different races. This one actually follows a adventuring party, if they can be called that, as they go from place to place. They go to different places within the world of Dungeons and Dragons and eat there. So they go to the Yawning Portal Inn at one point. They're called the Bureau of Dark Tables. Squirrel Dax, Sasha, Delia, and Bruan. But they go to places like the Yawning Portal. I know there is a table of contents here at some point, somewhere. Yes, here. So they go to the Yawning Portal, Realm Space, Ravenloft, the Feywild, and that is how the foods in this book are sort of separated. And it actually reuses the cover from the first book here. That's kind of interesting. I just noticed that. Why I think food in Dungeons and Dragons is kind of important. So this picture actually kind of illustrates it. I'm not making this connection necessarily just because I am a personal fan of food, but food and D&D are important in two different sort of ways. So it's important from the standpoint of inside your game, within the world of your game. The food is important because it can help to sort of contextualize where you are. As you can imagine, as you move through different areas, the food, much like in the real world, should not be the same from place to place. I understand it's a little different in the real world because we have things like chain restaurants where you can get, fast food in any country you can imagine. But for the most part, the cuisines of countries are different. You get different food in America than you would get in the United Kingdom, and than you would get in Australia, and that you would get in Asia and Japan, and all the Canada. I mean, you could just start naming countries. The food in Canada is different than the food in Japan. The food in Japan is different than the food, like I said, here in Missouri, in the United States. Missouri's food is different than the food in Ecuador. Kind of, and it should very much be the same inside your D&D game, because it can really sort of help to immerse your players. When your players are at a tavern or wherever, what you serve them through your descriptions as a dungeon master very much can sort of change and augment the sense of the world around them. And it can be a really, really valuable piece of world building. And it's one that I think has a lot of creativity without requiring a ton of brain power. You can sort of decide what should be served at any sort of place in your world and use that to flesh things out. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is super, like, uber thought out, and yet it can add quite a bit to the experience. And obviously, like I said, it gives you the opportunity to change things up as things go around. And maybe some places have really great cuisine, maybe other places have really awful cuisine. Whatever it is, you can choose to do however you see fit. Beyond within the game itself, I think food, maybe more so, and Dungeons & Dragons have a connection with the fact that Dungeons & Dragons is ultimately, though you are playing a game and that, you take it seriously, playing Dungeons & Dragons is a very communal activity. You're inviting friends, family, acquaintances who hopefully will become friends over to your abode or wherever you're playing, and you're having what is effectively kind of a party. You're playing a game. It's a different sort of party, but you are ultimately entertaining. And food is a huge part of entertainment. I think personally Dungeons and Dragons and food go hand in hand like hands in a glove, fingers in a glove, whatever. I think any D&D endeavor should in some way be connected to food and drink, preferably non-alcoholic drinks if you have people that are incapable of self-control, but because ultimately the goal is still to get through the game. But I think your game, whether it's big or small, should absolutely be accentuated with food. What I'm saying is, if you were the dungeon master and you were inviting people over to your house for a game, you should be serving them food. And I even made a joke about that in one of the Musings episodes. I think it was the episode about Knights of Pen and Paper, where I made a joke that eating D&D is about snacks, which is very true. And when I thought about that, as much, it kind of illustrated something about this book in particular. So this book, in comparison to the first book was very much written for people that had never cooked before. There were quite a few recipes in that book. I remember there was a candied bacon recipe. There was a mushroom steak recipe. There were several recipes in that book that were specifically and clearly designed to basically be impossible to screw up. That is not so much the case here. The recipes in this book are actually quite involved. There's a few simpler ones, but for the most part, they're very involved, especially some of the baking ones. Using multiple different types of flours, I'm someone that likes to cook, and I don't have, like, a lot of the recipes call for dark rye flour. I don't keep dark rye flour on hand, and I imagine the average person doesn't as well. So there's a recipe for lotus root somewhere in here. Even this onion loaf uses whole wheat and all-purpose flour. It's very much more an advanced sort of endeavor. The recipes themselves are more involved. They take a little more doing. You get the point. And while I can appreciate this, because these recipes I'm sure are fantastic, I haven't made a ton of them, though I have used some of them for inspiration. To me, I think a very unique problem with these sort of branded books, for as good as they are, as fun as they are to read, I really enjoyed reading this book, as well as not only the recipes themselves, and the descriptions of the recipes, but some of the added stuff with the Dark Tables party. None of these recipes, except for maybe some of the drinks, because there are still drinks in this book as well, as you see this Neverwinter Nectar. None of these recipes, unfortunately, both in this book or really even the first book, simple as they might be, are suited towards the playing of the game that they are derived from. All these recipes are pulled from D&D worlds, from whether it's the Forgotten Realms, whether it's Greyhawk, with these different areas. But they're not really well suited to actually being served to a group of people playing Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, I don't know about you, and maybe I'm wrong, but when I think of what I would like to chow down on when I'm playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons, stir-fried tofu and vegetables is not what comes to mind. And I'm sure this is delicious. I can't eat tofu because I can't do soy, because I have had the wonderful experience of kidney stones, of which soy can be a big driver of, but I'm sure this is delicious. It's not what I would want to eat when I'm playing Dungeons & Dragons. Because the food, though it should accentuate your experience of playing D&D with your friends and family, it should not surpass it. The idea should always be on the game. A lot of these recipes are so involved that, barring like some of the breads, and again some of the drinks, you could never actually serve these at a game. Right? And I think there's kind of a disconnect there, because it's like, yes, you're making these very cool recipes, and you have all this awesome artwork and photography from these D&D worlds, but you can't really use them for playing D&D. And I think that's really just kind of disappointing. Because, again, you would think if you're opening up the D&D cookbook, how cool would it be to make something from the D&D cookbook and serve it while playing D&D? And unfortunately, you just can't do, like, these Tears of Selûne. Are you going to serve fish skewers at your D&D game? I mean, maybe it's delicious. Herring? Are you going to serve smoked herring? No. You're going to eat this alone, and it's going to be delicious, but it kind of defeats the point of this being D&D related, in my opinion. Like I said, I still really enjoy these books. I think they're great. I pull them out. I read them every so often when I'm looking for some inspiration, or when I want an idea, or when I just like one of the recipes. But I don't think they're ultimately serving where they're drawn from. Now, you might ask, in my opinion, what sort of things should you be serving at a D&D game? You want to serve things that can, if you so choose, be ignored. Finger foods, snack foods, trail mixes, chips. Popcorn's great, because who doesn't love popcorn? Small things. Believe it or not, candies, gum is great at D&D games. As insane as that sounds, like I know it sounds weird, but put out like some hard candies at your next D&D game and your players will love you, I promise you. You want things that can be thoroughly enjoyed, but also easily ignored. So that when you are in the thick of the game, you can just say, well, it's not food time right now. I'm not going to be chomping on peanuts while we're fighting a chromatic dragon. But then, obviously, when you probably die after fighting said chromatic dragon, you can say, well, now I want some of those peanuts. That's another thing. A lot of this food is very, very perishable, which means it would not do well to sit out for a 3 or 4 hour session. That's what I think should define the food of a D&D session. It should be easily ignored, still delicious, but can sit out for a few hours. So again, finger foods, I wouldn't do cheese. I understand. Listen, I love charcuterie as much as the next guy. It gets kind of grody after like 2 hours, and no one really wants to admit it. But it kind of like when the cheese slices turn see-through, it's not great. I absolutely, like, that to me is where there's kind of a missed opportunity here. It misses the opportunity to really marry these worlds and the cuisines within the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons and the people actually playing Dungeons & Dragons. And I'm not saying that would be an easy thing to do, right? Like, I'm not saying it would be easy to come up with recipes that could simply be served in these settings, but I think it would have been really, really neat if there was a bit more of that. And because I think ultimately, and ultimately because when I talked about in the game itself how the food can help to immerse it, well, if you could make food, if you're playing in the Forgotten Realms and you could make food from the Forgotten Realms and then serve that food to your players, would that not also help to immerse them? Like, this food and Dungeons & Dragons has such a purpose with Dungeons & Dragons for its immersive qualities and what it can actually add to a game, to an experience, to the memorability of an area or a situation. And again, I think it would have been cool if some of these, like, this is something you could serve, the saw bread, which is basically, by the looks of it, just a very simple, quick bread. It looks like cornbread, but I don't think it is. It does not have any corn in it, it just has all-purpose flour. You know, you could do something like that. You know, you could serve this loaf. But I think, like, you can't serve this mac and cheese, although it looks real good. This is definitely a video where you want... this is definitely an episode where you want the video, by the way. Should have mentioned that. Like, this shrimp looks delicious, but I'm not serving shrimp to my players. So I think you kind of get my point. Is that you should be serving food at your Dungeons & Dragons game. Not just because it would make you a good host or your friends will like you more for it or whatever, but because it can legitimately elevate the experience of playing the game. And I think had some of these recipes been a bit more suited towards actually being served when you're playing Dungeons & Dragons, stuffed trout. Yeah, let's serve an entire trout to the table. I think it would have made this book that much better, because it's very good. These recipes are very cool. It's very well made, just as the first one was. The artwork's outstanding, as I said. The photography's outstanding. I could have done with a little more photography. I think I said that about the first book as well in my video about it. Like, I would be totally thrilled to make some of these drinks, but it would just really upset me that I couldn't make more of the food, because the only way you could really make some of this food is if you wanted to do it, like, after. Like, start your game, put a roast in the oven or something like that, and then finish it up and then eat it. But even then, I mean, you're not going to time that with a D&D game. If your friends who play D&D are anything like my friends who play D&D, good luck on that one, buddy. But I think food in D&D has a very natural connection. And that's why I love these books and any of these branded books, because they help us get closer to these worlds and games that we love. But I just would wish, like, if they were to make a third one, because I don't think there's a third one of these, I would love some more recipes. Like, do an entire section of recipes that can be served during the game. That would be really, really neat to me. I would recommend, if you are up for a bit more of a challenge, because like I said, these recipes are far, far more involved than the ones in the first book. If you're a novice, buy the first book, and it will definitely teach you a thing or two about how to cook. It definitely teach you a thing or two about how to cook. But if you're interested in that respect, then I would certainly... If you're a beginner, I would buy the first book. If you're more advanced, you can jump right to the second book. Though you should buy the first book as well, because the first book has fantastic... Go watch my video about the Bitopian shepherd's bread. It's delicious. And let me tell you, I know we don't have smell-o-vision in the world yet, but it was outstanding. Here's the lotus root that I was talking about earlier. As much as this scratches my nerd itch, the foodie part of me... God, I just referred to myself as a foodie. Oh! Oh, that's gross! I wish it was a bit more practical with regard to what it's being drawn from. Either way, this was me geeking out about food in Dungeons & Dragons. You should be serving food at your D&D games, and drinks. Again, maybe easy on the drinks. I would recommend going a bit easy on the drinks for the sake of everyone involved. And it should be easy to eat. It should not go bad over the course of your game. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I love this one, breaded bird cutlets. Because they say chicken, but you could theoretically, not that it would be a bird, but you could make this with any sort of cutlet. Obviously chicken, pork, veal, whatever. But yeah, I really am glad that I actually got a chance to talk about this book again. And I don't want it to come off that I don't like it. I just wish it were better suited towards playing D&D. Man, I had a joy reading this one. And like I said, the stories of the Dark Table are actually pretty funny. Not gonna lie. I really like this book. I think this book definitely had a clearer idea of what it wanted to be than the first one. And I think that shows. I wouldn't say it's necessarily better made, because the first book was also very well made as well. But this one, I think, has a bit more of a theme and a purpose behind it, as in advanced, but it tells a bit of a story. The recipes tell something of a story. And whatnot. So yeah. You can make crickets. I forgot about that. But yeah, that was me geeking out about food in Dungeons & Dragons for nearly 25 minutes. So if you sat here for this long, thank you. I appreciate you indulging me. And I'm not going to go make crickets, but I might make something from this book. I'm feeling inspired now as I've been flipping through it. I don't have crickets on hand, just as I don't have dark rye flour. You might have crickets on hand. If you do, stay away from me, please. But yeah, so the next time you're playing Dungeons & Dragons, maybe don't make the recipes from this book or the other book, but make sure you feed your players, please, and work it into your game worlds. Make it a conscious thing when food is a possibility to really elevate and uplift your world. It's a really easy way to add some immersion and a great way to sort of make your players feel a bit more connected to everything you've worked so hard to build in other areas. But that's it from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.